What if I told you that a single horse could prevent a terrorist attack that would have changed British history forever? This is the story of Blackthorn, a Friesian stallion whose supernatural instincts saved lives on one terrifying night in the Cotswolds. The thunder of hooves echoed across the rain-soaked fields of Gloucestershire like gunshots in the darkness. Blackthorn, a magnificent black Friesian stallion, galloped through the night with the fury of an ancient warhorse, his massive frame cutting through the mist like a phantom. Behind him, William Ashworth, the estate's head groom, was being dragged across the muddy ground, his weathered hands gripping the lead rope with desperate strength. The 50-year-old Yorkshire man had worked with horses for 3 decades, but he'd never experienced anything like this. "Easy, boy. What's gotten into you?" William gasped, his boots sliding through the wet grass as Blackthorn pulled him forward with unstoppable determination. The horse's eyes blazed with an otherworldly intensity, reflecting the distant lights of Harrington Estate's private airfield. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. 3 miles away, at the exclusive Harrington Airfield, 3 figures dressed in maintenance coveralls moved silently between the luxury jets parked on the tarmac. The facility served Britain's elite, politicians, royalty, and business magnates who valued privacy above all else. Tonight, it was supposed to host Lord Edmund Harrington's charity gala flight, carrying several high-ranking government officials to a humanitarian summit in Geneva. "Packages in position," whispered the lead terrorist into his encrypted radio, carefully placing a sophisticated explosive device inside the fuel compartment of Lord Edmund's private Gulfstream G650. The bomb was designed to detonate 30 minutes after takeoff, long enough to clear British airspace, but devastating enough to send a message that would shake the foundations of the British establishment. The second terrorist, a former military explosives expert who'd been radicalized after losing his family in a controversial overseas operation, methodically checked the timer. "Detonation sequence activated. No turning back now." Meanwhile, Blackthorn suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his powerful hooves pawing at the air as if fighting invisible demons. William, caught off guard, lost his grip on the rope and tumbled backward into a puddle. The stallion's haunting whinny pierced the night air, a sound that seemed to carry both warning and rage. "Blackthorn, what in God's name?" William started to say, but the words died in his throat as he saw where the horse was staring. The airfield lights glowed in the distance, and even from this far away, something felt fundamentally wrong about the scene. The horse had always been different. Born during a violent thunderstorm 8 years ago, Blackthorn had displayed an uncanny ability to sense danger before it manifested. Lord Edmund often joked that the stallion was worth more than most security systems, but William knew it wasn't a joke. The horse had prevented 3 accidents on the estate, warned of a gas leak that could have killed dozens, and once refused to let visitors enter a stable just minutes before a beam collapsed. Now, as Blackthorn began galloping toward the airfield with renewed urgency, William realized this wasn't just another of the horse's mysterious episodes. This was different. This was life or death. The third terrorist finished installing a backup detonator, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to accomplish. "Target confirmation received. Lord Edmund's flight manifest includes the Defense Secretary, 2 cabinet ministers, and 3 members of Parliament. This will cripple their government's leadership structure." As if summoned by some primal instinct, Blackthorn burst through the perimeter fence of the airfield like a black lightning bolt. The chain-link barrier, designed to keep out intruders, crumpled under the stallion's massive weight and momentum. Alarms began blaring across the facility. But the horse paid no attention to the chaos he'd created. The terrorists froze as the magnificent beast appeared in the harsh sodium lights of the tarmac, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian, steam rising from his flanks in the cool night air. For a moment, time seemed suspended as predator faced predator, ancient instinct confronting modern malice. "What the hell is that thing?" the lead terrorist hissed, reaching for the pistol concealed beneath his coveralls. But Blackthorn was already moving. His powerful muscles coiled like springs as he prepared to leap. The horse's eyes locked onto the explosive device visible through the aircraft's open maintenance panel, and something primal and protective surged through his massive frame. William finally caught up, his chest heaving from the desperate sprint across the fields. "Security! There's something wrong here!" he shouted at the top of his lungs, his Yorkshire accent cutting through the night air like a battle cry. The freeze-frame moment stretched endlessly as Blackthorn launched himself into the air, his hooves aimed directly at the terrorist holding the detonator. The question that would haunt everyone present burned in the darkness. How could a horse possibly understand the difference between salvation and destruction? The answer lay in 8 years of mysterious behavior, supernatural instincts, and a bond between man and beast that transcended ordinary understanding. But as Blackthorn hung suspended in the air, muscles straining and eyes blazing with righteous fury, one thing was absolutely certain: this night would change everything. In the grimy underbelly of East London, where broken dreams and shattered lives collide in brutal harmony, Marcus the Viper Thornfield ruled his domain with iron fists and a heart carved from stone. The abandoned warehouse that served as his underground training facility reeked of sweat, blood, and desperation. The perfect breeding ground for the kind of violence that polite society pretended didn't exist. The rhythmic pounding of fists against heavy bags echoed through the cavernous space like a war drum, punctuated by the sharp crack of bones meeting bone and the occasional grunt of pain from young men who'd come here seeking power but found only brutality. Thornfield moved between his students like a predator surveying his pack, his scarred hands clasped behind his back, his cold gray eyes missing nothing. "Harder!" he barked at a 17-year-old kid whose knuckles were already bleeding through his torn gloves. "The streets don't care about your comfort, boy. Pain is your teacher, and I'm your headmaster." Marcus Thornfield hadn't always been a fallen angel. 8 years ago, he'd been Captain Marcus Thornfield of the Special Air Service, one of Britain's most elite soldiers, decorated for valor in 3 different theaters of war. His record had been spotless, his loyalty unquestioned, his future bright with promise. Then came that night in Helmand Province when everything changed forever. The official report stated that Captain Thornfield had used excessive force during a hostage rescue operation, resulting in the deaths of 3 insurgents who had already surrendered. The unofficial truth was far more complex. Those insurgents had executed 2 British aid workers just hours before, including a young nurse who reminded Thornfield of his sister. When he found their mutilated bodies, something inside him snapped like a taut wire. The court-martial had been swift and merciless, stripped of rank, dishonorably discharged, and blacklisted from any government position. Thornfield found himself cast out from the only world he'd ever known. The military had been his family, his identity, his purpose, and Lord Edmund Harrington, as the Defense Ministry's liaison, had personally signed the papers that destroyed his life. Now, as he watched his latest crop of recruits pummel each other in the makeshift ring he'd constructed from old car tires and rope, Thornfield's phone buzzed with an encrypted message that would change everything. The caller ID showed only a series of numbers, but he recognized the pattern, a contact from his darker days, when desperate men paid handsomely for his particular set of skills. "Thornfield," he answered, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who'd screamed orders over gunfire for too many years. "The Viper," came the electronically distorted reply. "We have a proposition that might interest you. It involves settling an old debt with a certain lord of the realm." Thornfield's grip tightened on the phone as he stepped away from his students, moving into the shadows of a corner where rusty metal shelving created a natural barrier. "I'm listening." "Lord Edmund Harrington, the man who signed your discharge papers, the man who destroyed your career while he sits in his ivory tower, playing with his horses and counting his money." The voice paused, letting the words sink in like poison. "What if I told you there was a way to make him pay? A way to show the world that his precious aristocratic traditions are nothing but a facade?" The warehouse suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Thornfield could feel his pulse quickening, that familiar rush of adrenaline that had once made him one of the deadliest soldiers in the British Army. "What kind of way?" "There's a Captain James Fraser, SAS, currently on leave, training horses at Harrington's Estate. Word is he's got a special bond with some supernatural stallion that's become the old man's pride and joy. Challenge Fraser to a gentleman's duel, old-fashioned, traditional, the kind of spectacle that will draw attention from every corner of the internet." Thornfield's mind raced through the possibilities. A public humiliation of both Fraser and Harrington would be satisfying, but something about the caller's tone suggested there was more to this than simple revenge. "And what's in it for you?" "Let's just say that while everyone's watching your little show, other arrangements can be made. The kind that will send a message to the British establishment that their time of privilege is coming to an end." The line went dead, leaving Thornfield staring at his phone in the dim light of the warehouse. Around him, his students continued their brutal training, unaware that their instructor was contemplating something far more dangerous than street fighting. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about proving that the system that had cast him out was rotten to its core. He walked over to a punching bag that hung from a reinforced beam, its leather surface scarred and stained from years of abuse. With methodical precision, he began throwing combinations: jab, cross, hook, uppercut, each strike carrying the weight of 8 years of suppressed rage. His knuckles, already calloused from countless hours of training, split open against the unforgiving surface, but he didn't stop. "Boss?" One of his students, a wiry kid named Danny who'd been coming to the gym for 6 months, approached cautiously. "You all right? You look like you're about to murder that bag." Thornfield stopped mid-punch, his breathing heavy but controlled. "Danny, what do you know about horses?" The question caught the young man off guard. "Horses? Not much, boss. Why?" "Because I'm about to teach a lesson to some people who think their bloodlines make them better than us." Thornfield unwrapped his hands, revealing knuckles that were raw and bleeding. "And I'm going to need an audience." Over the next hour, Thornfield made a series of calls, reaching out to contacts in the underground fighting world, the dark web streaming community, and the shadowy networks of men who lived outside society's rules. By midnight, he had assembled a plan that would turn a simple challenge into a viral spectacle, drawing thousands of viewers who craved violence and chaos. The message he sent to Harrington Estate was crafted with military precision, designed to appeal to the old man's sense of honor while making refusal impossible without losing face. It spoke of tradition, of testing the mettle of Britain's finest, of settling disputes the way gentlemen had for centuries. But as Thornfield sealed the envelope and prepared to deliver his challenge, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being used as a pawn in a much larger game. The mysterious caller had been too eager, too prepared, too specific about the timing and the target. Still, the opportunity for revenge was too sweet to pass up, and if others wanted to use his vendetta for their own purposes, so be it. The devil of Thornfield was about to be unleashed, and God help anyone who stood in his way. The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Harrington Estate like ghostly fingers reaching through time itself, carrying with it the weight of 8 centuries of British nobility. As William Ashworth walked through the cobblestone courtyard toward the historic stables, his weathered boots echoing against stones that had been laid during the reign of Henry II, he couldn't help but feel the presence of generations past, watching over this sacred ground. The Harrington family had served the crown since 1215, when Sir Geoffrey de Harrington rode alongside the barons who forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. Through the Wars of the Roses, the Spanish Armada, Napoleon's campaigns, and 2 world wars, the Harringtons had bred horses for the British military. Magnificent beasts that carried knights into battle, pulled artillery through muddy trenches, and served as the backbone of cavalry charges that shaped the destiny of nations. William paused before the bronze plaque mounted beside the stable entrance, its green patina telling the story of centuries. In memory of the war horses of Harrington Estate, from Agincourt to Afghanistan, they served with honor. Below the inscription, a relief sculpture depicted a Friesian stallion rearing on its hind legs, its mane flowing like a battle banner in an invisible wind. Every morning, I read those words, William murmured to himself, his Yorkshire accent softening with reverence. And every morning, I remember why we do this. The stable itself was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, built in 1847 when the 5th Duke of Harrington decided that his horses deserved accommodations befitting their noble service. Soaring Gothic arches supported a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes from British military history, while stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across the polished oak floors. Each stall was spacious enough to house a small family, with brass nameplates that gleamed like gold in the filtered sunlight. But it was the occupant of the center stall that truly commanded attention. Blackthorn stood 17 hands high, his coat so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His mane cascaded down his powerful neck like a waterfall of midnight silk, and his eyes, those extraordinary eyes, held an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. When he looked at you, it felt as though he could see straight through to your soul. William approached the stallion's stall with the same reverence he might show entering a cathedral. "Morning, my prince," he whispered, extending his hand palm up. Blackthorn lowered his massive head and gently nuzzled the groom's weathered fingers, a gesture of trust that had taken months to earn. The memory of their first meeting 8 years ago remained as vivid as yesterday. It had been a night when the autumn storms raged across the Cotswolds with biblical fury, when lightning split the sky and thunder shook the very foundations of the estate. Lady Margaret Harrington, Lord Edmund's late wife, had been in the stable tending to a mare in labor when the contractions began in earnest. "The foal's coming wrong," she had called to William through the howling wind. "We might lose them both." But as the veterinarian worked frantically to save mother and child, something miraculous happened. At the exact moment when the lightning reached its most violent crescendo, when the thunder seemed to shake the earth itself, Blackthorn entered the world. He emerged not with the typical weakness of a newborn foal, but with his eyes already open, already alert, already aware of something the humans around him couldn't perceive. "I've never seen anything like it," the veterinarian had said, his voice filled with wonder. "It's as if he was born knowing secrets that the rest of us spend our whole lives trying to understand." Lady Margaret, holding the newborn foal as he struggled to his feet with impossible strength, had looked into those dark eyes and whispered, "You're going to be special, aren't you, little one? You're going to protect this family." She had been right in ways none of them could have imagined. Over the years, Blackthorn had displayed an uncanny ability to sense danger before it manifested. He had refused to enter a stable just minutes before a support beam collapsed, potentially saving the lives of 3 other horses and 2 stable hands. He had broken free from his stall one winter night and led William to a gas leak in the heating system that could have killed everyone in the servants' quarters. He had thrown riders who later discovered mechanical failures in their saddles that would have caused serious injury. But perhaps most remarkably, Blackthorn seemed to understand human emotions with an empathy that defied explanation. When Lady Margaret was diagnosed with cancer, the stallion would stand quietly by her side for hours, as if sharing his strength with her. When she passed away 2 years ago, Blackthorn had refused to eat for 3 days, standing vigil by the stable door as if waiting for her return. Now, as William prepared the stallion for his morning exercise, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about today. Blackthorn's usual calm demeanor was replaced by a restless energy, his ears constantly swiveling as if listening for sounds that human ears couldn't detect. "What is it, boy?" William asked, running his hands along the horse's powerful neck. "What's got you so worked up?" The answer came in the form of approaching footsteps on the cobblestones outside. William looked up to see Lord Edmund Harrington striding toward the stable, his silver hair gleaming in the morning light, his bearing still regal despite his 72 years. Behind him walked a younger man in military dress, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of alert posture that marked him immediately as a soldier. "William," Lord Edmund called out, his voice carrying the authority of 8 generations of nobility. "I'd like you to meet Captain James Fraser of the Special Air Service. He's going to be working with Blackthorn for the next few months." Fraser stepped forward, extending his hand with a firm grip that spoke of both strength and control. "Pleasure to meet you, William. I've heard remarkable things about this stallion of yours." "He's not mine, sir," William replied with characteristic humility. "I'm just the one privileged to care for him. But I can tell you this. In 20 years of working with horses, I've never met one quite like Blackthorn." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Blackthorn moved to the front of his stall, his dark eyes fixed intently on the newcomer. For a long moment, horse and soldier regarded each other in silence, as if taking each other's measure. Then slowly, Blackthorn extended his muzzle toward Fraser's outstretched hand. "Well, I'll be damned," Fraser murmured, his Scottish accent adding warmth to his words. "He's choosing to trust me." "That's more than most people get on first meeting," William observed. "Blackthorn's particular about who he accepts." Lord Edmund smiled, the expression transforming his austere features. "Captain Fraser will be preparing Blackthorn for the Royal Charity Exhibition next month. It's a tradition that goes back to my great-grandfather's time, demonstrating the partnership between the military and our finest horses." But as the 3 men discussed training schedules and exhibition routines, none of them noticed the way Blackthorn's ears kept turning toward the distant sound of vehicles on the estate's private road, or how his nostrils flared as if detecting a scent that carried with it the promise of danger. The traditions of Harrington Estate were about to be tested in ways that 8 centuries of history had never prepared them for. The morning sun painted the Cotswolds countryside in shades of gold and emerald as Captain James Fraser stood at the edge of the training paddock, watching Blackthorn move with the fluid grace of liquid shadow across the dew-kissed grass. In his 15 years of military service, Fraser had worked with some of the finest horses in the British Army, but he'd never encountered anything quite like this magnificent Friesian stallion. Fraser's weathered hands gripped the wooden fence rail as memories flooded back to his childhood in the Scottish Highlands, where his grandfather had taught him that some horses were born with souls that touched something beyond the ordinary world. "Laddie," the old man had whispered during those long summer evenings, "there are horses that carry the spirits of ancient warriors, and if you're blessed enough to meet one, you'll know it the moment you look into their eyes." Now, watching Blackthorn's powerful muscles ripple beneath his midnight coat, Fraser understood exactly what his grandfather had meant. This wasn't just a horse. This was something far more profound, something that seemed to bridge the gap between the natural world and the supernatural realm that most people refused to acknowledge. "He's reading the wind," Fraser murmured to William, who stood beside him with the quiet pride of a man who devoted his life to understanding these magnificent creatures. "Look at the way his ears move, the way he's testing the air. He's not just aware of what's happening now. He's anticipating what's coming next." William nodded slowly, his Yorkshire accent thick with emotion. "Aye, Captain. I've seen him do things that would make your hair stand on end. 3 months ago, he refused to let Lady Catherine mount him for her morning ride. Threw such a fit that we thought he'd gone mad. 20 minutes later, we found a wasp nest in her saddle that would have sent her to the hospital if she'd been stung." Fraser's military training had taught him to be skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured, analyzed, and explained through conventional logic. But his Celtic heritage whispered of older truths, of connections between living beings that transcended the boundaries of science and reason. As he watched Blackthorn suddenly freeze in the middle of the paddock, his head raised high and his nostrils flaring as if detecting some invisible threat, Fraser felt the familiar tingle of recognition that had saved his life more times than he could count in Afghanistan and Iraq. "There," Fraser said quietly, pointing to where Blackthorn stood motionless, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. "He's sensing something we can't perceive. In the military, we call it situational awareness. But this goes beyond training. This is pure instinct operating on a level that most humans have forgotten how to access." The captain's mind drifted back to his most harrowing mission in Helmand Province, when his unit had been tasked with rescuing a group of aid workers from a Taliban stronghold. They'd been moving through a seemingly empty village when their pack horse, a sturdy Afghan mare named Courage, had suddenly refused to take another step. Despite the urgency of their mission, something in the mare's behavior had made Fraser order his men to halt. 30 seconds later, an IED had detonated exactly where they would have been walking, triggered by a pressure plate that their sophisticated equipment had failed to detect. The horse had saved 8 lives that day, and Fraser had never forgotten the lesson. Sometimes the oldest forms of intelligence were still the most reliable. Now, as he opened the paddock gate and approached Blackthorn with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who understood that respect must be earned rather than demanded, Fraser felt that same electric connection he'd experienced with Courage. The stallion's dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to peer straight through to his soul, evaluating not just his intentions, but the very essence of his character. "Easy, boy," Fraser whispered, extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful approach. "I'm not here to dominate you. I'm here to learn from you." Blackthorn took 3 careful steps forward, his massive hooves making no sound on the soft earth despite his incredible size. When he finally lowered his head to sniff Fraser's outstretched hand, the moment felt charged with significance, as if two warriors from different species were acknowledging each other's worth. The touch of the stallion's velvet muzzle against his palm sent a jolt of recognition through Fraser's entire body. In that instant, he understood that this partnership would be unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This wasn't going to be about training a horse to follow human commands. This was going to be about learning to communicate with a creature whose intelligence operated on frequencies that most people couldn't even imagine. Lord Edmund mentioned that you've been having some unusual experiences with Blackthorn, Fraser said to William, never taking his eyes off the horse. I'd like to hear about them. All of them, no matter how strange they might sound. William's weathered face creased with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Well, Captain, where do I begin? Last winter, he broke out of his stall in the middle of a blizzard and led me straight to a section of fence where the snow had hidden a gas leak from the heating system. If he hadn't done that, the whole stable block could have gone up in flames. Fraser nodded, his military mind already cataloging the implications. What else? 2 summers ago, during the county fair, he refused to let anyone near the west side of the exhibition tent, kept rearing up and making such a racket that we had to move his demonstration to the other side of the grounds. An hour later, a support cable snapped and brought down half the tent structure right where he'd been refusing to go. As William continued recounting incident after incident, Fraser began to see a pattern that both fascinated and concerned him. Blackthorn wasn't just displaying heightened awareness. He was demonstrating an ability to perceive threats that existed in potential rather than reality, as if he could sense the convergence of circumstances that would lead to danger before those circumstances actually aligned. There's something else, Captain, William said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Sometimes, late at night, I've seen him standing at the fence that faces toward London, just staring into the darkness like he's watching for something. And lately, those episodes have been getting more frequent. Fraser felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. His years of counterterrorism work had taught him to recognize the signs when multiple threat streams began converging, and everything about Blackthorn's recent behavior suggested that something significant was building toward a crescendo. William, he said carefully, I need you to start keeping a detailed log of every unusual behavior you observe. Times, dates, weather conditions, anything that might seem relevant. And I want you to pay special attention to which direction he's looking when these episodes occur. The older man nodded gravely. You think there's something specific he's sensing, don't you? Fraser placed his hand on Blackthorn's powerful neck, feeling the steady rhythm of the stallion's pulse beneath his palm. I think we're dealing with something that goes far beyond normal equine behavior, and if my experience has taught me anything, it's that when an animal with this level of sensitivity starts showing signs of persistent unease, it usually means that trouble is heading our way, whether we can see it coming or not. As if responding to Fraser's words, Blackthorn suddenly raised his head and looked directly toward the distant spires of London, his ears pricked forward and his entire body radiating an alertness that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. In that moment, Fraser knew with absolute certainty that their peaceful training sessions were about to become something far more dangerous and far more important than anyone could have imagined. The secret Fraser carried wasn't just his ability to work with horses. It was his recognition that in a world increasingly dominated by technology and artificial intelligence, the oldest forms of natural intelligence might still hold the keys to survival. The morning mist had barely lifted from the ancient cobblestones of Harrington Estate when the sound of motorcycle engines shattered the peaceful silence like thunder rolling across the Cotswolds countryside. William Ashworth looked up from mucking out Blackthorn's stall, his weathered hands gripping the pitchfork as 3 black motorcycles roared through the estate's wrought iron gates, their riders dressed in dark leather that seemed to absorb the pale English sunlight. The lead rider dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator, removing his helmet to reveal the scarred face of Marcus the Viper Thornfield. His gray eyes swept across the historic stable complex with the calculating assessment of a man who had spent years studying targets before striking. Behind him, 2 younger men flanked his position, street fighters from his underground gym, their knuckles scarred and their eyes hard with the kind of violence that came from growing up in London's most dangerous neighborhoods. "Well, well," Thornfield said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who had screamed orders over gunfire in Afghanistan. "So this is where the mighty Captain Fraser has been hiding, playing with ponies while real soldiers do the dirty work." Fraser emerged from the training paddock where he had been working with Blackthorn on advanced maneuvers, his military bearing immediately apparent in the way he carried himself. The stallion followed behind him, his massive frame radiating an alertness that seemed almost supernatural, his dark eyes fixed on the intruders with an intensity that made the air itself feel charged with electricity. "Marcus Thornfield," Fraser said quietly, his Scottish accent adding weight to each word. "I heard you'd fallen far, but I didn't realize you'd sunk to the level of showing up uninvited at private estates with your street thugs." Thornfield's laugh was like broken glass scraping against concrete. "Street thugs? These boys have more real fighting experience than half the pretty boys in your precious SAS. They've earned their scars in places where your fancy training manuals don't mean shit." Lord Edmund appeared at the stable entrance, his aristocratic bearing unchanged despite the obvious tension crackling through the morning air. At 72, he had seen enough of life to recognize dangerous men when they appeared on his doorstep, and everything about Thornfield screamed violence barely held in check. "Gentlemen," Lord Edmund said with the kind of calm authority that came from 8 generations of dealing with difficult situations, "I assume you have some business here that couldn't be conducted through proper channels?" Thornfield pulled a sealed envelope from his leather jacket, the paper expensive and formal, a deliberate contrast to his rough appearance. "I have a proposition for Captain Fraser here, a challenge, if you will. Something that should appeal to a man who claims to represent the finest traditions of British military excellence." Fraser accepted the envelope, his trained eyes noting the quality of the paper, the formal wax seal, the careful calligraphy that spoke of someone with education and resources behind this confrontation. As he read the contents, his expression remained carefully neutral, but William could see the tension building in his shoulders. "A gentleman's duel," Fraser said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and dark amusement. "Mounted combat? Traditional weapons? Conducted according to the old codes of honor? You're challenging me to settle some imagined grievance through trial by combat." "Not imagined," Thornfield snarled, his carefully constructed facade slipping to reveal the rage that had been festering for 8 years. "You and your kind destroyed my life, Fraser. Threw me away like garbage because I had the balls to do what needed to be done when the politicians were too weak to make the hard choices. Now I'm offering you a chance to prove that your precious traditions are worth more than the paper they're written on." Behind Thornfield, one of his companions was already setting up a sophisticated camera system, the kind of equipment used for high-end streaming operations. The other was checking his phone, monitoring what appeared to be multiple social media feeds and betting platforms. "This is going out live," Thornfield continued, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a man who understood the power of public spectacle. "Thousands of people are already watching, placing bets, waiting to see if the famous Captain Fraser and his supernatural horse are everything the stories claim them to be." William felt Blackthorn tense beside him, the stallion's massive muscles coiling like springs as he sensed the malevolent energy radiating from the intruders. The horse's nostrils flared as if detecting a scent that carried with it the promise of violence and chaos, and his ears swiveled constantly as if listening for sounds that human ears couldn't perceive. "The terms are simple," Thornfield said, pulling a tablet from his saddlebag and showing the screen to Fraser. "Traditional mounted combat, but with a modern twist. We fight until one of us yields or is unable to continue. The winner takes all: respect, reputation, and the right to claim superiority." Fraser studied the screen, his military mind automatically analyzing the tactical implications of what he was seeing. The betting odds were already heavily in favor of Thornfield, with thousands of viewers from around the world placing wagers on the outcome. Comments were streaming past in multiple languages, most of them expressing bloodthirsty anticipation for violence. "And if I refuse?" Fraser asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then the world sees that the legendary Captain Fraser is nothing but a coward who hides behind his horse and his title." Thornfield replied with a predatory smile. "Your reputation, your family's honor, your precious military traditions, all of it becomes a joke that gets shared across every platform on the internet." Lord Edmund stepped forward, his aristocratic features hardening with the kind of resolve that had carried his family through 8 centuries of challenges. "Captain Fraser is a guest in my home and under my protection. If you wish to issue challenges, you'll do so through proper channels and with appropriate respect for the traditions you claim to honor." "Traditions?" Thornfield spat, his composure finally cracking completely. "What do you know about tradition, old man? You've spent your whole life playing dress-up in your castle while real men bled and died to protect your comfortable little world. Your traditions are nothing but theater for tourists and tax breaks for the wealthy." The insult hung in the air like a physical blow, and William could see the way it affected both Lord Edmund and Fraser. But it was Blackthorn's reaction that truly caught his attention. The stallion suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his powerful hooves pawing at the air as if fighting invisible demons, his haunting whinny piercing the morning air with a sound that seemed to carry both warning and rage. "Easy, boy," William whispered. But even as he spoke the words, he realized that Blackthorn wasn't reacting to the confrontation between the men. The horse was staring past them all, his dark eyes fixed on something in the distance that none of the humans could see or understand. Fraser made his decision with the kind of calm certainty that had made him one of the SAS's most respected officers. "I accept your challenge, Thornfield. But we do this properly, with rules and safeguards, not as some barbaric spectacle for your online audience." "Rules?" Thornfield laughed, but there was something hollow about the sound now, as if he was beginning to realize that he might have bitten off more than he could chew. "The only rule that matters is the one that says the last man standing wins." As the two men began discussing the specifics of their confrontation, none of them noticed the way Blackthorn continued to stare toward the distant spires of London, his entire body radiating an alertness that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. The horse had sensed something that went far beyond the immediate threat posed by Thornfield and his companions, something that would soon transform their personal vendetta into a matter of national security. The challenge had been issued and accepted, But the real battle was only just beginning. The ancient meadow of Harrington Estate had witnessed 8 centuries of history, but nothing had prepared it for the spectacle that was about to unfold on this gray English morning. The field stretched out like a natural amphitheater, bordered by centuries-old oak trees whose gnarled branches seemed to lean inward as if eager to witness the confrontation between honor and vengeance that was about to play out on the emerald grass below. Marcus Thornfield sat astride a massive black gelding he'd borrowed from a contact in London's underground racing circuit, a beast bred for speed and aggression rather than nobility, its eyes wild with the kind of barely controlled violence that mirrored its rider's soul. The horse's coat gleamed with sweat despite the cool morning air, and its constant pawing at the ground sent clods of earth flying like bullets from a machine gun. On the opposite end of the field, Captain James Fraser mounted Blackthorn with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life mastering the art of mounted combat. The Friesian stallion stood perfectly still, his massive frame radiating a calm confidence that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. His midnight coat absorbed the pale sunlight like a black hole, and his dark eyes remained fixed on Thornfield with the unwavering focus of a predator studying its prey. Between them, Lord Edmund stood in his formal morning coat, holding a white handkerchief that would signal the beginning of what had become the most watched underground streaming event in British history. Thousands of viewers from around the world were logged into the encrypted platforms that Thornfield's associates had established, their comments streaming past in a blur of multiple languages as betting odds shifted in real time. "Gentlemen," Lord Edmund called out, his aristocratic voice carrying across the field with the authority of 8 generations of nobility. "You have agreed to settle your differences according to the ancient codes of honor that have governed such disputes for centuries. The rules are simple: mounted combat with traditional weapons until one yields or is rendered unable to continue." Fraser drew his cavalry saber, the blade singing as it cleared the scabbard with a sound like wind through steel. The weapon had been forged in 1847 by the same craftsman who had created swords for the charge of the Light Brigade, and its edge gleamed with the kind of perfection that could only be achieved through generations of military tradition. Thornfield's weapon was different, a modern tactical sword designed for close-quarters combat, its black blade serrated along one edge and weighted for maximum damage rather than elegance. He held it with the casual familiarity of a man who had used similar weapons to kill enemies in the mountains of Afghanistan, and his grip spoke of experience earned through blood rather than training. "Last chance to back down, Fraser," Thornfield called out, his voice carrying across the field like a challenge thrown down by the devil himself. "Walk away now, and I'll let you keep what's left of your reputation." Fraser's response was to lower his saber in a formal salute, the gesture so perfectly executed that it seemed to embody everything noble about British military tradition. "The only thing I'll be walking away with today is the satisfaction of defending the honor of better men than you could ever hope to be." Lord Edmund raised the white handkerchief, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stopped blowing, as if nature itself was waiting to see which man would prove worthy of victory. Then the handkerchief dropped, and both riders spurred their mounts forward with the fury of medieval knights charging into battle. The thunder of hooves against earth shook the ground like an earthquake as the 2 horses closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. Blackthorn moved with the fluid grace of liquid shadow, his powerful muscles propelling him forward with a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of Fraser's heart. Thornfield's gelding ran with the desperate fury of a creature driven by fear and aggression, foam flying from its mouth as it strained to match the Friesian's supernatural speed. They met in the center of the field, with a clash that echoed across the Cotswolds, like thunder, steel ringing against steel as their blades locked together in a test of strength and skill. Fraser fought with the disciplined precision of classical swordsmanship, each movement flowing into the next with the kind of perfection that could only be achieved through years of dedicated training. But Thornfield fought like a man with nothing left to lose, using every dirty trick he'd learned in the back alleys of London and the killing fields of Afghanistan. He aimed for Fraser's horse rather than the rider, trying to cripple Blackthorn with slashing attacks that would have ended the fight before it truly began. That was his first mistake. Blackthorn seemed to anticipate every move before Thornfield made it, dancing away from the black blade with movements that defied the laws of physics for a creature of his size. The stallion's supernatural awareness allowed him to avoid attacks that should have been impossible to see coming, and his own counter-movements put Fraser in perfect position to land devastating strikes against his opponent. "Fight me, not the horse!" Fraser shouted, his Scottish accent thick with righteous anger as he parried another attempt to wound Blackthorn. "If you want to prove you're a warrior, then fight like one." Thornfield's response was to wheel his mount around and charge again, this time aiming his blade directly at Fraser's throat in a move that would have been lethal if it had connected. But as he closed the distance, something extraordinary happened. Blackthorn suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his massive hooves pawing at the air as if he was fighting invisible demons. The movement threw off Thornfield's timing completely, causing his blade to whistle harmlessly past Fraser's head while leaving him completely exposed to a counterattack. Fraser's saber swept down in a perfect arc, the flat of the blade striking Thornfield across the shoulder with enough force to knock him sideways in his saddle. But Thornfield had survived too many real battles to be finished by a single blow. He rolled with the impact, using his momentum to swing his own weapon in a vicious backhand that would have opened Fraser's throat if it had connected. Instead, the blade met empty air as Blackthorn performed another impossible maneuver, dropping to his knees and then springing forward like a coiled spring. The crowd watching online erupted in comments that scrolled past too fast to read, their excitement building to a fever pitch as they witnessed something that seemed to transcend ordinary combat. This wasn't just a fight between two men. This was a battle between two completely different philosophies of warfare, with honor and tradition facing off against brutality and desperation. Fraser pressed his advantage, his saber weaving patterns in the air that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Each strike was perfectly placed, designed to disable rather than kill, to prove his superiority without descending to his opponent's level of savagery. But Thornfield refused to yield, fighting with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. Then, just as it seemed that Fraser was about to deliver the decisive blow, Blackthorn suddenly froze in the middle of the field. His massive head swung toward the distant spires of London, his nostrils flaring as if he had detected a scent that carried with it the promise of far greater danger than the man they were currently fighting. The stallion's haunting whinny pierced the morning air like a siren, and in that moment, everyone present realized that the real battle was only just beginning. The clash of steel against steel echoed across the ancient meadow like thunder rolling through the Cotswolds countryside. But something had fundamentally changed in the rhythm of the battle. Blackthorn's massive frame stood frozen in the center of the field, his dark eyes fixed on the distant spires of London with an intensity that seemed to pierce through time and space itself. The stallion's nostrils flared, as if detecting a scent that carried with it the promise of far greater danger than the man they were currently fighting. Captain James Fraser felt the change in his mount immediately. that electric connection between horse and rider that had been forged through countless hours of training, suddenly crackling with urgent warning. Blackthorn's supernatural awareness was screaming that something was terribly wrong, something that went far beyond the personal vendetta playing out on the grass beneath them. "What is it, boy?" Fraser whispered, his Scottish accent thick with concern as he felt Blackthorn's muscles coil like steel springs beneath him. The stallion's haunting whinny pierced the morning air like a siren, and in that moment, everyone present realized that their carefully choreographed duel had become something far more dangerous. Marcus Thornfield, still mounted on his borrowed gelding and breathing heavily from the exertion of combat, lowered his tactical sword as confusion replaced the rage that had been driving him forward. "What the hell is wrong with that beast?" he snarled, but there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before. A note of uncertainty that suggested he was beginning to realize that he might have been played for a fool. William Ashworth, who had been watching the confrontation from the sidelines, with the kind of nervous energy that came from 20 years of caring for horses, suddenly understood what Blackthorn was trying to tell them. The stallion wasn't just sensing danger. He was sensing betrayal, deception, a threat that had been hidden beneath layers of misdirection and carefully orchestrated theater. "Captain Fraser!" William shouted, his Yorkshire accent cutting through the morning air like a knife. "The airfield! Blackthorn's been trying to warn us about the airfield all morning!" The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with terrifying clarity. Fraser's military mind, trained to recognize patterns and identify threats, suddenly saw the bigger picture that had been hidden behind Thornfield's challenge. The timing was too perfect, the streaming setup too sophisticated, the whole spectacle designed to draw attention away from something far more sinister. "You bastard," Fraser said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that had made him one of the SAS's most feared operators. "This whole thing was a distraction, wasn't it? While everyone's watching us play at being medieval knights, your real partners are doing something at the airfield." Thornfield's face went pale as the implications hit him like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? This is about you and me, about settling old scores and proving who's the better man." But even as he spoke the words, Thornfield could hear the hollowness in his own voice. The mysterious caller who had set this whole thing in motion, the sophisticated streaming equipment that his associates had provided, the insistence on this specific timing, it all pointed to a conspiracy that went far beyond his personal desire for revenge. Lord Edmund, who had been serving as the formal referee for their duel, suddenly dropped his white handkerchief and began running toward the estate's main house with the kind of urgency that only came from recognizing mortal danger. "Security!" he shouted at the top of his lungs, his aristocratic composure finally cracking under the weight of realization. "All units to the airfield immediately!" Fraser didn't wait for official confirmation. He spurred Blackthorn toward the distant airfield, the stallion responding with explosive power that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The Friesian's massive hooves thundered against the earth as he stretched into a full gallop, his supernatural awareness guiding them toward whatever threat was waiting in the shadows of the private aviation facility. Behind them, Thornfield sat motionless on his borrowed mount, the tactical sword hanging limply in his grip as the full magnitude of his manipulation became clear. He had been used as a pawn in someone else's game, his legitimate grievances weaponized to serve an agenda that he had never agreed to support. "Sir," one of his associates, the young man who had been operating the streaming equipment, came running across the field with his tablet clutched in his hands. "We're getting reports of suspicious activity at the airfield. Multiple vehicles, unauthorized personnel, and someone's been asking questions about Lord Edmund's flight schedule. The blood drained from Thornfield's face as he realized that his desire for revenge had made him complicit in something far worse than a simple assault on aristocratic pride. "What kind of suspicious activity?" he demanded, his military training reasserting itself despite the chaos swirling around him. "Maintenance crews that nobody authorized, equipment that doesn't match the standard protocols, and communications that are being routed through encrypted channels that the estate's security can't monitor," the young man replied, his voice shaking with the kind of fear that came from realizing that they had stumbled into something that could get them all killed. Fraser and Blackthorn reached the perimeter of the airfield just as the first explosion rocked the facility. A controlled detonation that sent a column of black smoke rising into the gray English sky. The stallion reared up on his hind legs, his powerful hooves pawing at the air as if fighting invisible demons, his dark eyes reflecting the orange glow of flames that were already beginning to spread across the tarmac. "Bloody hell," Fraser breathed, his Scottish accent thick with disbelief as he surveyed the scene before them. 3 luxury jets were parked on the runway, including Lord Edmund's personal Gulfstream G650 that was scheduled to carry several high-ranking government officials to a humanitarian summit in Geneva. Figures in maintenance coveralls were moving between the aircraft with the kind of purposeful efficiency that spoke of military training and careful planning. But it was what Blackthorn was staring at that truly caught Fraser's attention. A 4th aircraft that hadn't been there during his morning reconnaissance. A sleek black helicopter that bore no identifying markings and seemed to shimmer in the morning light like a mirage. The stallion's supernatural awareness was focused on that aircraft with laser-like intensity, as if he could sense something about it that human eyes couldn't perceive. Fraser pulled out his encrypted military communication device and began transmitting on the emergency frequency that would alert every security agency in Britain to the threat they were facing. "This is Captain James Fraser, SAS, reporting a code-red terrorist incident at Harrington Estate Airfield. Multiple aircraft compromised. Unknown number of hostiles. Immediate response required." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the distant sound of helicopter rotors could be heard approaching from multiple directions, while ground units began converging on the estate from every major road in Gloucestershire. But Fraser knew that minutes might be too long. If the terrorists had already planted their devices and were preparing to execute their plan, every second counted. Blackthorn suddenly wheeled around, his massive head swinging toward a section of the airfield that appeared empty but somehow felt wrong to his supernatural senses. The stallion's nostrils flared as he detected something that human technology had missed, some trace of explosive material or electronic signature that only his ancient instincts could perceive. "There," Fraser said quietly, following his mount's gaze toward what appeared to be an innocent maintenance shed. "That's where they're coordinating from. That's where we'll find the answers we need." As they prepared to charge toward the shed, Fraser couldn't help but marvel at the complexity of the plot that had been unfolding around them. Someone had orchestrated Thornfield's challenge not just as a distraction, but as a way to test the estate's security response and identify weaknesses that could be exploited during the real attack. The question that burned in his mind as Blackthorn gathered himself for another explosive charge was simple but terrifying. How many other estates? How many other targets? How many other carefully planned distractions were being executed at this very moment across Britain? The answer would determine whether they were dealing with a single terrorist cell or something far more dangerous. A coordinated assault on the very foundations of British society itself. The thunder of helicopter rotors filled the gray English sky as Captain James Fraser spurred Blackthorn toward the Harrington Estate airfield with the desperate urgency of a man who knew that seconds could mean the difference between life and death. The Friesian stallion's massive hooves pounded against the earth like artillery shells, each stride covering ground with supernatural speed as his dark eyes remained fixed on the distant plumes of black smoke rising from the aviation facility. Behind them, William Ashworth clung to the back of Fraser's military Land Rover as it bounced and lurched across the rough terrain, his weathered hands gripping the roll bar with white-knuckled intensity. The Yorkshire groom's face was pale with the kind of fear that came from realizing that their peaceful morning had transformed into a matter of national security. But his eyes burned with the same determination that had carried his ancestors through 2 world wars. "There!" Fraser shouted over the roar of approaching aircraft, pointing toward a section of the airfield where Blackthorn's supernatural awareness had detected the hidden threat. "The maintenance shed behind the fuel depot. That's where they're coordinating the attack." The stallion responded to his rider's urgency by stretching into an even faster gallop, his powerful muscles propelling them forward with the kind of explosive speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. As they crested the small hill that overlooked the airfield, the full scope of the terrorist operation became terrifyingly clear. 3 luxury jets sat on the tarmac like sitting ducks, including Lord Edmund's personal Gulfstream G650 that was scheduled to carry the Prime Minister and several cabinet ministers to an emergency NATO summit in Brussels. Figures in maintenance coveralls moved between the aircraft with military precision, their movements coordinated by hand signals and encrypted radio communications that spoke of extensive planning and professional training. But it was the 4th aircraft that truly caught Fraser's attention, a sleek black helicopter that bore no identifying markings and seemed to shimmer in the morning light like a mirage. The unmarked chopper sat at the far end of the runway, its rotors already beginning to turn as if preparing for immediate departure. "Extraction vehicle," Fraser muttered, his military mind automatically analyzing the tactical situation. "They're planning to hit the targets and disappear before anyone can respond." Blackthorn suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his massive frame silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky as his haunting whinny pierced the air like a battle cry. The stallion's supernatural senses had detected something that human technology had missed: the electronic signature of multiple explosive devices hidden throughout the aircraft, each one timed to detonate at different altitudes to maximize the psychological impact of the attack. Fraser pulled out his encrypted military communication device and began transmitting on the emergency frequency that connected him directly to the Joint Terrorism Analysis Center in London. "This is Captain Fraser, SAS, reporting Code Black terrorist incident at Harrington Estate Airfield. Multiple aircraft compromised with explosive devices, unknown number of hostiles, immediate bomb disposal required." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the distant sound of additional helicopter rotors could be heard approaching from multiple directions, while ground units began converging on the estate from every major road in Gloucestershire. But Fraser knew that minutes might be too long. If the terrorists were following their planned timeline, the Prime Minister's flight was scheduled to depart in less than 30 minutes. "William!" Fraser called out as the Land Rover skidded to a halt beside them. "I need you to guide the bomb disposal teams to the exact locations where Blackthorn indicates. His senses are more accurate than any electronic detection equipment we have." The Yorkshire groom nodded grimly, his face set with the kind of resolve that had made his people the backbone of British industry for generations. "Aye, Captain. Blackthorn's never been wrong about danger, and he's not about to start now." As if responding to his name, The stallion suddenly wheeled around and began trotting toward the maintenance shed with the purposeful stride of a creature on a mission. His nostrils flared as he detected the scent of plastic explosives and electronic detonators, while his ears swiveled constantly to track the movements of the terrorists, who were still unaware that their carefully planned operation had been compromised. The first wave of counterterrorism units arrived in a thunder of rotor blades and squealing tires, their black-clad figures rappelling from helicopters and emerging from armored vehicles with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and absolute professionalism. Fraser recognized several faces from his own SAS unit, men who had served alongside him in Afghanistan and Iraq, and their presence filled him with confidence that the situation was finally under control. "Captain Fraser." The voice belonged to Major Sarah Collins, the commanding officer of the Metropolitan Police's Counterterrorism Command, her crisp London accent cutting through the chaos with military authority. "We have eyes on 6 hostiles, all armed with automatic weapons and wearing suicide vests. They've barricaded themselves in the control tower and are threatening to detonate if we approach." Fraser dismounted from Blackthorn and approached the major with the kind of calm professionalism that had made him one of the SAS's most respected officers. "Ma'am, the real threat isn't the hostiles in the tower. It's the explosive devices they've already planted in the aircraft. My horse has identified at least 3 separate locations where bombs have been concealed." Major Collins raised an eyebrow at the mention of using a horse for bomb detection, but Fraser's reputation preceded him, and she had learned to trust unconventional methods when conventional ones failed. "Show me," she said simply. Blackthorn led them directly to Lord Edmund's Gulfstream, his massive head lowering to sniff at a section of the aircraft's fuselage that appeared completely normal to human eyes. But when the bomb disposal experts ran their electronic scanners over the area, they immediately detected the signature of a sophisticated explosive device hidden within the fuel compartment. "Jesus Christ," whispered the lead technician, his face pale beneath his protective helmet. "This is military-grade C4 with a remote detonator. If this had gone off at cruising altitude, it would have vaporized the entire aircraft." But Blackthorn wasn't finished. The stallion moved systematically from aircraft to aircraft, his supernatural senses guiding the bomb disposal teams to hidden devices that their equipment might have missed. Each discovery revealed a level of sophistication and planning that spoke of state-sponsored terrorism rather than a simple revenge plot. "How many more?" Major Collins asked, her voice tight with the kind of stress that came from realizing that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a typical terrorist cell. Fraser placed his hand on Blackthorn's powerful neck, feeling the steady rhythm of the stallion's pulse beneath his palm. "He's telling me there's one more. Something big. Something that's meant to be the centerpiece of their operation." The answer came in the form of Blackthorn suddenly charging toward the unmarked helicopter, his hooves throwing up clouds of dust as he galloped across the tarmac with renewed urgency. The aircraft's rotors were spinning faster now, and figures in flight suits were beginning to board, as if preparing for immediate departure. "That's not an extraction vehicle," Fraser realized with growing horror. "That's a delivery system. They're planning to use it to attack a secondary target while everyone's focused on the airfield." The helicopter began to lift off just as the counterterrorism units reached its position, but Blackthorn's warning had given them the precious seconds they needed to respond. Surface-to-air missiles streaked across the morning sky, their contrails writing messages of justice against the gray clouds as they found their target with devastating accuracy. The explosion lit up the Cotswolds countryside like a second sun, the shockwave rattling windows for miles around as the terrorist helicopter disintegrated in a ball of orange flame. But even as the debris rained down on the airfield, Fraser knew that their victory was incomplete. Somewhere out there, other cells were probably executing similar operations, and only Blackthorn's supernatural awareness had prevented this one from succeeding. As the smoke cleared and the immediate danger passed, Fraser looked down at the stallion who had saved countless lives through his mysterious gift. "Good boy," he whispered, his Scottish accent thick with emotion. "You did it again, didn't you? You saved us all." Blackthorn's response was to nuzzle Fraser's shoulder with the gentle affection of a creature who understood that their bond transcended the ordinary relationship between man and horse. In a world increasingly dominated by technology and artificial intelligence, the oldest forms of natural intelligence had once again proven their worth. The royal rescue was complete, but the questions it raised about the nature of perception, intuition, and the mysterious connections between all living things would echo through the halls of power for years to come. The morning after the terrorist attack at Harrington Estate, the ancient stone walls of Cambridge University's Department of Veterinary Medicine buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt since the discovery of DNA structure in 1953. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the world's leading expert in animal behavioral psychology, stood before a packed lecture hall filled with scientists, military officials, and intelligence analysts who had traveled from across Europe to understand how a single horse had prevented what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack in British history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Hartwell began, her crisp Oxford accent carrying the authority of 30 years spent studying the mysterious connections between human and animal consciousness. "What we witnessed yesterday at Harrington Estate challenges everything we thought we knew about the limitations of animal perception and the nature of intuitive intelligence itself." The massive screen behind her displayed high-definition footage captured by the estate's security cameras, showing Blackthorn's supernatural awareness in action as he detected threats that the most sophisticated electronic surveillance systems had completely missed. Frame by frame, the evidence was undeniable. The Friesian stallion had demonstrated abilities that transcended ordinary sensory perception. Traditional science has long dismissed animal intuition as mere coincidence or anthropomorphic wishful thinking. Dr. Hartwell continued, clicking to the next slide, which showed brain scans comparing human and equine neural activity. But recent advances in neuroscience and quantum biology are revealing that animals may possess sensory capabilities that operate on frequencies we're only beginning to understand. In the front row, Captain James Fraser sat beside William Ashworth, both men still processing the magnitude of what they had experienced. Fraser's military training had taught him to trust his instincts, but Blackthorn's performance had demonstrated a level of awareness that seemed to operate beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. "The horse's olfactory system," Dr. Hartwell explained, gesturing to a detailed anatomical diagram, "contains over 300 million scent receptors compared to our mere 6 million. But more importantly, these receptors are connected to neural pathways that process information in ways that bypass the analytical filters that often limit human perception." Dr. Marcus Webb, a quantum physicist from Oxford who had been studying the intersection of consciousness and quantum mechanics for 2 decades, stepped forward to address the audience. His wild gray hair and intense blue eyes gave him the appearance of a mad scientist, but his credentials were impeccable, and his research had been quietly funded by intelligence agencies around the world. "What Dr. Hartwell is describing," Webb said, his voice carrying the excitement of a man who had spent his career chasing theoretical possibilities that were suddenly becoming demonstrable facts, "aligns perfectly with emerging theories about quantum entanglement in biological systems. We're discovering that living organisms may be capable of detecting quantum field fluctuations, that carry information about future probability states. The audience stirred with a mixture of fascination and skepticism as Webb clicked to a slide showing complex mathematical equations that described the quantum mechanics of biological consciousness. In simple terms, Blackthorn may have been detecting the quantum signatures of explosive materials and hostile intentions before they manifested as physical threats. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the Director of Military Intelligence who had flown in from London specifically for this briefing, raised her hand with the kind of authoritative gesture that commanded immediate attention. "Dr. Webb, are you suggesting that this horse was literally seeing into the future?" Webb's response was measured but revolutionary. "Not seeing the future in a mystical sense, Colonel, but rather detecting the quantum probability patterns that indicate which potential futures are most likely to manifest. It's similar to how migrating birds can navigate using magnetic fields that humans can't perceive, or how dogs can detect seizures hours before they occur." Fraser found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories of Highland horses that could sense approaching storms days before any weather instruments detected atmospheric changes. The old man had always insisted that animals possessed a form of intelligence that operated on principles that modern science was too arrogant to acknowledge. "The implications for national security are staggering," Dr. Hartwell continued, clicking to a slide that showed statistical analysis of Blackthorn's threat detection accuracy over the past 8 years. "This animal has demonstrated a 100% success rate in identifying genuine dangers while producing 0 false positives. No electronic surveillance system in the world can match that performance." Dr. Amanda Chen, a neurobiologist from MIT who had been studying the electromagnetic properties of animal consciousness, stood to address the group. Her research had been classified for years, but the events at Harrington Estate had convinced her superiors to declassify some of her most groundbreaking findings. "We've discovered that certain animals, particularly those with strong emotional bonds to humans, can detect changes in electromagnetic fields that precede violent or destructive events," Chen explained, her American accent adding a different perspective to the predominantly British gathering. "The human brain, when experiencing intense emotions like hatred or the intention to cause harm, generates specific electromagnetic signatures that sensitive animals can perceive from considerable distances." William Ashworth, who had spent 20 years observing Blackthorn's behavior, finally spoke up from his position in the front row. "Begging your pardon, doctors, but what you're describing sounds exactly like what I've been seeing all along. Blackthorn doesn't just react to danger, he reacts to evil intentions. He can sense when someone means harm, even if they're trying to hide it." The room fell silent as the implications of William's observation sank in. If animals could detect malevolent intentions before they were acted upon, the applications for counterterrorism and criminal investigation were revolutionary. Dr. Hartwell nodded gravely. "Mr. Ashworth's observation aligns with our latest research into what we're calling intentional field detection. We believe that conscious intentions, particularly those involving violence or deception, create measurable disturbances in local quantum fields that certain animals can perceive." General Robert Blackwood, the head of Britain's Special Forces Command, leaned forward with the intense focus of a man who had spent his career dealing with threats that conventional intelligence couldn't predict. "How do we weaponize this capability? How do we train other animals to replicate what Blackthorn accomplished?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the scientists had been discussing. Dr. Webb exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding with characteristic academic caution. "General, that's the trillion-dollar question. We believe that Blackthorn's abilities are the result of a unique combination of genetic predisposition, environmental factors, and most importantly, his emotional bond with humans who genuinely care about his welfare. You can't manufacture that kind of connection in a laboratory. Fraser stood up, his military bearing commanding attention as he addressed the assembled experts. With respect, doctors, you're missing the most important point. This isn't about creating weapons or surveillance tools. It's about rediscovering forms of intelligence that our ancestors understood, but that we've forgotten in our rush to embrace technology. The captain's words carried the weight of personal experience as he continued. Blackthorn didn't save those lives because he was trained to detect explosives. He saved them because he cares about protecting the people he loves. That's not something you can program into a machine or replicate in a training facility. Dr. Hartwell smiled, recognizing the wisdom in Fraser's observation. Captain Fraser has identified the crucial element that our research consistently confirms. The most remarkable animal abilities emerge from relationships built on mutual trust, respect, and genuine affection. Blackthorn's supernatural awareness is inseparable from his emotional connection to the humans in his life. As the briefing continued, the assembled experts began to understand that they weren't just studying an unusual animal. They were examining the foundations of consciousness itself and the mysterious ways that love, loyalty, and intuition could transcend the boundaries of species and science. The implications would reshape intelligence gathering, military strategy, and humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world for generations to come. 6 months after the terrorist attack that shook the foundations of British security, the ancient halls of Buckingham Palace echoed with the measured footsteps of history being made. William Ashworth, dressed in formal morning coat that felt foreign against his weathered Yorkshire frame, walked slowly toward the throne room where Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II waited to bestow upon him an honor that no horse groom had received in over 2 centuries. The transformation of the humble stable hand into Sir William Ashworth, Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire, represented more than just recognition of his role in preventing a national catastrophe. It symbolized Britain's acknowledgement that wisdom and courage could emerge from the most unexpected places, and that the bond between human and animal could transcend the boundaries of species to serve the greater good. "I never imagined," William whispered to himself as he approached the ornate doors, "that caring for horses would lead to this moment." Behind him, in the palace courtyard, Blackthorn stood in a specially constructed stall that had been erected for the ceremony. The magnificent Friesian stallion wore a ceremonial bridle crafted by the same artisans who had created regalia for royal horses for 3 centuries, his midnight coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the pale London sunlight. Thousands of spectators lined the mall, their cameras capturing every moment of what the media had dubbed the horse that saved Britain. Lord Edmund Harrington, now bearing the additional title of Special Advisor to the Crown on National Security Innovation, stood beside Captain James Fraser as they watched the ceremony unfold on the massive screens that had been erected throughout the courtyard. The events at Harrington Estate had elevated both men to positions of unprecedented influence within the British establishment, but neither had forgotten the lessons learned from their partnership with an extraordinary animal. "Fraser," Lord Edmund said quietly, his aristocratic voice carrying the weight of 8 centuries of family tradition, "I've received final approval from the Prime Minister for the Blackthorn Initiative. Parliament has allocated £50 million for the first phase of the program." Fraser nodded, his Scottish accent softening with emotion as he replied, "It's not about the money, my lord. It's about preserving something that we almost lost. The understanding that intelligence comes in many forms, and that sometimes the oldest forms are still the most reliable." The Blackthorn Initiative represented a revolutionary approach to national security that combined cutting-edge technology with ancient wisdom. Teams of specially selected horses and their human partners would be stationed at critical infrastructure sites throughout the United Kingdom, their supernatural awareness serving as an early warning system that could detect threats before conventional surveillance methods even knew they existed. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had been appointed as the program's chief scientific advisor, stood among the distinguished guests with a mixture of professional pride and personal amazement. Her research into animal consciousness had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, and universities around the world were now scrambling to establish similar programs based on her groundbreaking work. The applications extend far beyond counterterrorism, she had explained to the parliamentary committee that approved the funding. Animals with enhanced sensory capabilities could revolutionize everything from medical diagnosis to environmental monitoring. We're not just creating a security program, we're opening a new frontier in human-animal collaboration. As the ceremony reached its climax, Queen Elizabeth herself emerged from the palace, her presence commanding the kind of reverence that only comes from a lifetime of dedicated service to the crown. At 98 years old, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had witnessed the transformation of an empire into a modern nation, and her decision to personally knight William Ashworth sent a clear message about the importance of recognizing heroism in all its forms. "Mr. Ashworth," the Queen said, her voice carrying the authority of 7 decades on the throne, "your devotion to the care of animals and your courage in the face of danger exemplify the finest traditions of British service. It is our pleasure to bestow upon you the honor of knighthood." The ancient sword touched William's shoulders with the same ceremonial precision that had been used to knight warriors for 1,000 years. But this time, the recipient was a man whose weapon had been compassion rather than steel, whose battlefield had been a stable rather than a foreign shore. "Rise, Sir William," the Queen commanded, and as the newly minted knight stood to face the cheering crowd, Blackthorn's haunting whinny pierced the air like a fanfare of triumph. The ceremony concluded with the formal announcement of the Blackthorn Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to advancing the understanding of animal intelligence and its applications for human welfare. The Foundation's headquarters would be established at Harrington Estate, with Sir William serving as its first director and Captain Fraser as head of field operations. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Marcus the Viper Thornfield, serving a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation with counterterrorism investigators, was granted permission to attend the ceremony via video link from his prison cell. The former SAS officer who had been manipulated into serving as a distraction for the terrorist plot had undergone a profound transformation during his months of incarceration. "Sir William," Thornfield said, his voice carrying none of the bitter rage that had defined him during their confrontation, "I want to apologize for my role in endangering innocent lives. I allowed my personal grievances to blind me to the bigger picture, and I'm grateful that you and Blackthorn were there to prevent the tragedy that my actions could have caused." The apology was broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world, serving as a powerful reminder that redemption was possible even for those who had fallen furthest from grace. Thornfield's cooperation with authorities had led to the dismantling of 3 separate terrorist cells, and his insights into the psychology of radicalization were now being used to develop new approaches to preventing extremist recruitment. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Sir William walked slowly back to where Blackthorn waited in his ceremonial stall. The stallion lowered his massive head to nuzzle his longtime companion, the gesture carrying all the affection and trust that had developed between them over 8 years of shared experiences. "Well, boy," Sir William whispered, his Yorkshire accent thick with emotion, "we've come a long way from that stormy night when you were born. Who would have thought that a stable hand and his horse could change the course of history?" Blackthorn's response was to gently nip at the ceremonial medal that now hung from Sir William's chest, as if acknowledging that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. The Blackthorn Initiative would soon expand beyond Britain's borders, with allied nations requesting assistance in establishing their own animal-assisted security programs. Captain Fraser approached them both, his military bearing softened by the kind of smile that came from witnessing something truly extraordinary. "The first class of recruits reports for training next month," he said. 12 horses, 12 handlers, and a chance to prove that what happened here wasn't just a fluke. As the sun set over London, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard, the three men who had been brought together by circumstance and united by their shared bond with an extraordinary animal stood in comfortable silence. They had prevented a national tragedy, revolutionized approaches to security and intelligence, and demonstrated that the partnership between humans and animals could transcend the boundaries of species to serve the greater good. The legacy of Blackthorn would live on, not just in the programs and foundations that bore his name, but in the fundamental shift in understanding that he had inspired. In an age of artificial intelligence and technological supremacy, a single horse had reminded the world that natural intelligence, intuition, and the bonds of loyalty and love remained humanity's most powerful tools for survival. Do you believe in the power of instinct? Share your stories about times when you trusted your gut feelings in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and the animals who share our world.